All right, so for this video example, we're going to be going over some modeling techniques inside of Blender. If you are new to Blender, then you're going to want to pay attention to this. If you're experienced in Blender, then you can skip to the next part of the video, which will be going over sculpting techniques and sculpting in general, how to sculpt. All right. So for this first part, what we're going to do is we're going to be going over just the very basics of controlling inside of Blender. All right, so if you didn't mess with any of your navigation settings inside of the preferences, then this should be something that, this should be something that's vanilla for you. All right, so what we're going to do is using the vanilla navigation settings inside of Blender. In order to select stuff, you're going to left click on it to select it. Okay. And if you drag out, you can actually also select it. And some of your selection brushes or some of your selection tools are inside of here. So you can go with the circle, which will paint select things. So as you're dragging over it, it will paint select it. We also have lasso select, where if you drag out, you get a lasso, just like any Photoshop editing software. And of course, we also have our tweak, where we can actually sit here and we can drag objects around in the scene. But my favorite is actually the box selection and a lasso selection. So while holding shift, you can select multiple items. While holding control, you can deselect other items. Okay. So in doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to select these two. We're going to hit X on our keyboard, and that's going to ask us if we want to delete these objects. X universally is basically deleting an object, if you don't know. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to hit X, and we're just going to delete these objects. We're going to go and box select our box, and we're going to hit Alt G. That's going to move it back into place. If we rotate it and we hit Alt R, that's going to reset the rotation. And if we scale it and hit Alt S, that's going to reset the scale. All right. And if you want to apply, so if we go over here and we look at our item, you can see that as we're scaling it, these properties over here are going to change. So as you can see, we've changed all these properties. So whenever you select an item, this is your properties menu right here. This is what you're getting. As you can see, it's universal on all dimensions. But if we start to drag this out, you can see that we are tweaking with these settings. All right. So if we hit Alt S, Alt G, Alt R, that's going to reset all of these properties. Now, if I want to scale this up and leave it at this dimension, excuse me, leave it at this dimension, if I hit Control A, that's going to bring up my Apply Transforms menu. So we can hit Apply All, and that's going to set everything back. Scale, location, rotation. That's going to reset all of these back to default property, but it's also going to keep our changes that we just made. All right, so if I hit SX, you can see that the dimension is like that. Now, if I do hit Control A and apply all, you'll notice that the dimensions are going to stay the same. That's just the shape of the object. You can't really reset this back to 0 because it's just basically telling you what the dimension is. All right. There we go. All right. So if you want to save, you hit Control S. That's going to bring up your menu. Now, if you don't have this pie menu, it's probably because you need to go to your add-ons and you need to search up pie. And usually interface pie menus is probably the one that you want to get. This is the one I usually use. It helps a lot for speeding up your process, speeding up your workflow. All right, so this is mainly the one that I use. So if we hit Control S, you can see that it's our save menu has popped up. If we hit Alt A, that'll actually deselect everything. If we hit Tab, that's going to go into edit mode. All right, if we hit Control Tab, that's going to bring up our pie menu for all of our menus that you can usually find over here in this menu right here, where it's object mode, edit mode, sculpt mode, vertex, weight, and texture painting. If we hit Control Tab, that's going to bring up all of these menus all in the same area. All right. So if we want to go to sculpting, we just hit Control Tab, and now we're in sculpting, and we can start sculpting. If we want to go back to object mode, we can just hit Control Tab, and that's going to set us back over to object mode. And if we want to go into edit mode, we just go back into we just keep selecting object and edit mode up at the top. All right. So now that we got some of that out of the way, let's go over some of the navigation. So if we hold shift and we middle mouse click, we can actually pan around the viewport. All right. So that's how you pan around the viewport. Now if we hit shift and, or excuse me, alt and left click, we can actually rotate around the viewport just like so. And if we control and middle mouse, I always forget this one. This one's always awkward. If we control middle mouse up and down, we can actually zoom in and out of our scene. All right. So very helpful for getting very precise zooming in on our details. Alternatively, if you want to zoom in, you can actually hit the period on your numpad on your keyboard, which will actually zoom you right into what you're selecting. All right. Control Z undoes. All right. Excuse me. Control Z undoes. And now let's get back. Let's get into the actual modeling of the tutorial. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to hit Tab or Control Tab and select our edit mode. And if we actually Control R, we can actually add an edge slice here. And if we actually select these objects and hit G, we can actually start to move these vertices around, as you can see. If we hit R, we can rotate these vertices, and if we hit S, we can scale these vertices. Now, there's also an alternative scaling inside of inside of Blender. If you hit Alt S, you can actually scale away from the normals of the object. So if you don't know what normals are basically these lines that show you the direction in which the geometry is being calculated at. So this is basically information for a artist to kind of visualize the direction in which these objects are pointing. So these vertices are pointing in a direction. You just have to figure out what direction they're pointing in. And since it's like most of the time it's averaged in order to give the geometry its look and shape, it's going to be averaged out based on the neighboring components. And what a component is basically a component is an edge component, face component, and of course a vert component. All right, so those are the components. And usually these normals directions have to deal with averaging out based on the direction of which its neighbor is going. So if I delete this vertice, then the direction of this is going to change to average out based on what the geometry is updating. So now as you can see, since I deleted that, now this one is facing this way, and then these ones are trying to average based on that. All right. It's very complicated, but when you start working with geometry more and more, you start to get used to a lot of this stuff. All right. So let's turn that off. So what I mean by this is that when you're scaling it with the Alt S, it's actually scaling in that direction. It's trying to average those normals, and it's scaling in those directions. All right. So if we turn on our normals for this again, you can see that it's actually going along those normals. It's scaling with those normal directions. All right. So that is alternatively the alternate scaling inside of Blender. All right. So if you want to actually add edges, you can hit Control R, add an edge, and that's going to give you your supporting loops and more geometry. If you want to actually delete this, you can actually go and delete the edges by hitting X, and that's going to bring up your pie menu. We're not going to go into detail about every single one of these as it's not needed because I don't really use a lot of these, but pretty much here you're going to have your vanilla deletion. You're going to basically delete it from existence, and all of that geometry that's connected to it is also going to be dissolved and deleted. All right, but there's an alternative deletion, and that's called dissolving. So what dissolving does is it only gets rid of that thing that you're selecting. It tries to maintain the shape of the geometry, and it also tries to maintain the geometry in general without actually deleting anything. All right. So I use that a lot because sometimes when I add an edge loop and I go, okay, well, I did a few steps after that, but I don't really like this edge loop anymore. It's not really for me. What I do is I end up going and I end up dissolving that. And as you can see, when I dissolve that, it actually dissolves the vertices as well, which makes it lose the shape. And it goes back to its original shape. So that's something that you have to be aware of when you are working inside of Blender. All right. Or pretty much any software, is when you actually delete something, let's say I dissolve this, it's going to lose those vertices because you're saying that you also want those vertices gone when you're selecting the edge. All right. So in order to extrude a face, so what extrusion is it's basically kind of just like duplicating it, but also extending it. And that's really helpful for getting more shape. So if we actually start to move this and rotate this around, you can see that we're actually making a different shape, extended shape from our original cube. All right. So it's very helpful for organic modeling. And as you can see, when I'm hitting G, you can see that it's actually rotating based off of the screen, my screen. So if I were to hit rotate right now, you can see that the face is rotating based off of the invisible axis that my screen is creating, my viewpoint is creating. So if you think about, your screen or your viewport, and there's an invisible line shooting straight from your screen to the object, that's essentially a new axis that you're creating. So there's the X, Y, and Z axis, but there's also your screen space. So as you can see, now we're creating an axis from this view, we're creating an axis from this view, and if I were to actually turn it to a weird view, you could see now we're creating an axis from this view. So not only do you have X, so if I rotate on the X, SX, SX, scale it along the X, scale it along the Y, SY, scale it along the Z, but you can also see that I'm also scaling it based off of my view, rotating it based off of my view. You can't scale it based on your view. It just scales away from the average the average vertices. It just scales away from that. So you can't really scale based on your viewpoint, but you can move based on your viewpoint. You can rotate based on your viewpoint. And then there's also an alternative rotation. If I were to double tap R, you could see that I'm actually rotating around a very kind of pivotal axis, which basically just generates a pivot point in the center of this object that I'm selecting, and I can then rotate around that pivot. So that's really weird to get used to. Sometimes I use this, sometimes I don't. But it's something that you have to get used to if you're going to be working in 3D. Sometimes you don't want to move your mouse, or you don't want to move your view because it looks very dynamic, and you kind of want to rotate this object, maybe making this, flat or more towards the camera. That's just something that you're going to have to get used to. And then what we can do is we can then, scale it and then keep on moving it and rotating it and scaling it. And that's just something that you're going to get used to as you're modeling inside of Blender. All right, so we're going to delete those faces. And if I hit F on my keyboard, that'll actually create a new face. So if I select these two edges, hit 2 on my keyboard, select these two edges, hit F, then we can actually fill in that face. So what I didn't go over is selecting 1, 2, 3 on your keyboard. We'll actually select your vertice with 1, select your edges with 2, and then select your faces with 3. Now, if we were to actually go back to 2, you could see that while selecting the faces, and then we go back to our edge selection, it actually retained our face selection. And that's pretty cool about Blender, as well as some other software, that if you were to select if you were to select these two vertices and then hit 2, it'll retain the edge selection between them. But if you were to go into face selection, obviously because I was only selecting one edge and not a full ring of edges, it's going to drop my edge selection entirely. So you have to be aware of that. So if you're in selection, if you're in edge selection, and then you're like, okay, well, now I want to select the faces, and then you go back to your edge selection, it's actually going to drop your original selection for the new selection that you made. All right. So this little object that looks like a circular candy cane is actually called your 3D cursor. And if you don't want to see that, you can actually go into your viewport and turn that off and on. As well as any lights or anything like that, you can actually turn that off as well by hitting extras. If you don't want to see your lights or cameras in the scene, if you don't want to see your bones, you can hit that. And if you actually want to see your wireframe, you actually just hit this. And if I go out of this, you can now see that I can see my wireframe in the viewport. So if I actually turn that off, you can see what it does. Okay. All right. So the reason why I bring up the 3D cursor is because this is initially where your objects are going to spawn in at. It really helps for quick placement. So if I were to hold shift and right click and drag around and hit shift A, I can actually add my objects to this cursor area, which is very nice. It actually does a very good job of applying our objects to this area. All right, Shift A is usually how you add new objects into your edit mode. You can also Shift A to add additional objects into your viewport. All right, as well as going up here and going to your objects and adding, add your objects through here as well. You can also, if you're selecting an object, you can actually do multiple things like set the origin, set the transform, apply, snap, basically those things that we went on to before. We can actually also shade smooth in this as well. So yeah. All right. You can also extrude edges as well. Forgot to mention that, but like I said, the 3D cursor is really good for adding new objects because this is often used for when I want to like remesh something. You can see that if I go out of tab mode, you can see that now those objects are now placed together and they're connected. And usually I do this a lot. Okay, these are your modifiers. This is where you're going to add your mirror modifier, your mesh deform. We'll be going over a little bit of that in the videos as well by adding the mirror modifier. I think we also go over some remeshing as well. These are basically like tools that you can use to extend the modeling features of your objects. It does various things like solidify. If I were to actually go in here, a good example of solidify, if I were to shift D to duplicate this off, hit L to select all of this, delete it, X to delete, and then we were to go in here and add a solidify, it's actually going to add that extrusion for us, and it's all procedural, so I don't have to worry about this this being a problem. So if you wanted to make clothing, this is a really good way for you to kind of like make clothing. And all of this geometry, if we were to go up to our wireframe and turn that on, is actually geometry. All right, so if we were to actually apply this, we won't be able to edit this geometry until we've actually applied it. So another way that you can actually move geometry inside of Blender is if you double tap G, this will actually slide the geometry based on the edge flow. So I can then slide this, and it's going to slide it on a locked axis. As you can see, it's either up or down, up or sideways. And that's really good for, again, getting really complex shapes. All right. So, Alt G. Control B is to bevel. So if you want to add more edges, Control B is to bevel, and this is really good for making supporting edge loops. So if we were to go in here and Control B to bevel, you can see that we're actually getting some supporting edge loops. It is very complex, so use it with a grain of salt. Control B. Really good for getting supporting edge loops very, very quickly. But it does come with the drawback of, you know, you need to clean up the geometry. So if we go in here and we actually want to clean up the geometry, we can hit K. This will go into our knife mode, and if we hit right click, it'll actually retain that edge. And then we can go into our next edge while rotating around the viewport with our middle mouse. We can actually go in and create the rest of that geometry, as you can see right there. There are a little bit of pinching issues right here, but that's perfectly fine. That's just because of how we set up our geometry. If you want to actually see what your modifier looks like without the cage, you can actually hit this right here, and that's going to bring up the real-time wireframe. But if you want to turn that off, you can. And if you want to turn off the modifier itself, you can actually hit this button right here, and that's going to turn off your wireframe so that you can see. All right. So that's pretty much all of the tools that I really use inside of here. You can also hit Shift S and then Object to Cursor, I believe. Let's see. Selection to Cursor, keep the offset, which is actually very nice if you want to quickly place stuff that you've modeled where your cursor is. But yeah, that's essentially what I do inside of here. I think the last things to go over would be kind of like our display options. So if I were to actually add a cube into here, Shift S, cursor to world origin, Shift S, object to world origin. So a lot of the stuff in here, usually I'll switch to, this is kind of like your viewport shading options. So basically what this does, it allows you to visually see your stuff a little bit better. And usually when you go into sculpt mode, a lot of stuff is turned off, as you can see. In the viewport modeling, it's not turned off. But basically what it is this object right here is being toggled, and you can turn off everything. You can turn off all of this through here, as well as going through here and kind of setting your viewport. So I like to kind of set my viewport a little bit darker and have my matte cap set to something that's a little bit brighter, because it allows me to kind of see the outer silhouette of the object versus the background. If we were to have something that was kind of like similar to the background, it would be very hard to see our silhouette. So we really want our silhouette to pop from our background so that we can see. We also want our inner silhouette objects to pop as well. And what I mean by an inner silhouette is if I have some stuff going on here, if I just quickly go into our sculpting mode and I actually let's turn on Dynatopo. Let's turn this let's turn it down to 3. Are we actually getting, yeah, here we go. Our inner silhouette is basically, you can see the shadow right here. This is essentially an inner silhouette shape. We get these just by sculpting in general. They're, you know, sculpting landmarks is mostly how we get these. But this is like an inner silhouette. And it also contributes sometimes to the outer silhouette as well as you're rotating around the mesh. So we'll be going into detail about that a little bit later on when we start the sculpting. But and these objects, this is how you basically want to set it up. So you want to set up a comfortable environment for sculpting, not only for sculpting the silhouette, but also for your eyes, because sometimes your eyes do get strained by looking at the computer for a very long time. So you want to set that up according to that. All right. So usually what I do is I usually like this nice tanned matte cap with a viewport, and then I'll set that viewport to a little bit lower like that, just to get a nice comfortable viewport to start sculpting in. All right. And these are your mirror options when you start to actually edit. So the reason why I bring that up inside of the sculpting part of this is because it's also used for your modeling. So if we actually go into edit mode, you can see that we also have this as well inside of here. And you can also do topology mirror. So if we actually get rid of this cube, Shift A, add a cube, go in here, hit X. Let me actually toggle back on my X axis so I can see where that is. Now you can see that we're actually getting a mirroring. So this is sometimes helpful if you don't want to apply a mirror modifier to your object. But one thing that's interesting is that if you have geometry that isn't always like on the x-axis. So if we were to actually move this object over to here, maybe over here, and then we were to do this. Wow, it actually is still working. Let's see if we can kind of jailbreak this. Turn this off. And then this. So if we do have like an axis that's like not working, I think sometimes if you go over to your X, turn that on, go over to topology mirror, it's supposed to work. That's interesting. What about global? No? Topology-based mirroring where both sides of the mesh have matching and unique topology. Okay, so yeah, this is basically like if the object were to have the same topology on both sides that are close but not exactly mirrored, then I would think that this would have like let's see. I'm trying to think of a way that we can actually kind of like mess this up. All right, so I think if we turn this on and then we do topology mirror, yeah, it turns it off because this is actually in the center of that. But if we add this back, does it work? That's interesting. I never knew that about Blender, that it does that. Sides of mesh have matching and unique topology. Well, it is matching, but it's not working. I think I broke it. But anyways, this is actually your mirroring options right here. And this is obviously your auto merge vertices. So if you actually grab this and you start to get close to another vertice, it'll actually auto merge it together. Supposed to. Let's turn on vertex and snap. And yeah, it merged it together, as you can see. So if we snap that together, what is that doing? What? Weird. I think I actually, oh no. Okay, there we go. And this is just helpful for really quickly editing. Again, I don't use most of this stuff. I probably will in the future as I start to get more and more complex with Blender, but I don't use any of this stuff inside of Blender in the tutorial the course. So you don't have to worry too much about that. But it is a pretty decent way of getting like some interesting shapes from your designs if you're working on armor and whatnot. But yeah, let's go over to the sculpting part of the video. Yeah, we'll go over some sculpting techniques. All right, see you there. All right, going over our sculpting video. This will be actually pretty easy simply because I only use the tools that are given to me inside of the sculpting menu. I don't really bring in any outside alphas, even though I probably should. I don't really do any of that stuff in this tutorial series because it's just going over the basics of sculpting and hopefully trying to help you guys learn a little bit more about my sculpting process and how to get started on your own. All right. So as you can see by the viewport as of right now, you can see that over here you have all of your brushes to choose from. In order to bring up some of the basic brushes of this menu, you can hit W on your keyboard, and that will allow you to bring up your pie menu that allows you to bring up a lot of these brushes that you'll probably use within this pie menu. However, I didn't see that there's the draw sharp. I usually use that a lot. Yeah, but the crease is also a good substitute for the draw sharp as well. I just like the draw sharp because it's essentially the draw, but it's actually just in a little bit sharper of a and also it's subtractive rather than additive, which the drawing is additive, as you can see, but the draw sharp is actually sharper. So it actually it helps for like creating wrinkles and things like that for your characters. All right. So we also have some keybinds in here. I don't know all of the keybinds. I know that P is to bring up your pinching brush. So if we were to actually, since we are sculpting right now and it's pretty basic, If you hit F, you can actually size up and down the brush. And as you can see, pinching, or P brings up our pinching brush. S, if you hold down S, is actually to smooth the geometry or smooth the sculpt down. You can actually change the radius of your brush up here as well. So, and also the strength of your brush. So you can make it very, very strong, or you can make it very, very weak, depending. So as you can see, I am doing it. It is giving me a little bit of change, but not too quickly, which is something I use a lot when I'm sculpting. I don't like to have the strength all the way maximum, or even very close to the mid area of this, simply because I am a mouse sculptor, and it's very hard for me to use sensitivity like that. All right. So I'm not going to go over every single one of these brushes. They pretty much explain themselves when you're looking at it and you're like, okay, what does a cloth brush do? Well, this is just a brush, depending on the resolution of your model, to give you kind of a cloth shape. Now, it can also give you wrinkles if you really want to have that kind of wrinkled look. So if you wanted a character to look mad, you can actually put wrinkles on your character. To kind of get those, like, you know, those wrinkles on their forehead. This is essentially what skin does anyways as we get older, is it kind of droops down and it creates like these wrinkles. You know, it loses that elasticity as we get older. So, you know, some things to look at when you're you know, doing your sculpting for your characters. All right. Again, I'm not going to go over every single brush and what they do. It's, you know, it's just something that you want to play with. So if you, like, you know, you want to see what any of these brushes do, you know, just have like a low poly, like, you know, cube in here, and just kind of, you know, just kind of mess around with them and see what they do. You know, clay thumb looks like a clay thumb. You know, you're pressing your thumb into it and you're pushing with your thumb. You know, clay strips. Essentially, I use this one a lot as well for building up forms. Again, I don't like to have the strength all the way up, so I like to build up these forms kind of gradually to help me out. This is a nice one for also getting kind of details and wrinkles and lines. Clay, you know, this one gives you a nice softer version of clay strips. See, this is exactly why I don't need to bring in alphas, because, you know, you pretty much have a lot of your stuff here. G actually gives you the grab brush, which allows you to kind of move your forms, which is something that's very useful. I use this religiously when I'm working on the silhouette. So again, if we go up here, we go to a madcap, that's nice. We go to viewport, we set the viewport down, something that's low. You can see the silhouette a little bit better, and you can actually sculpt a little bit better of the silhouette, right? In combination with the smooth brush, we can actually kind of get a really nice silhouette going. Takes a lot of practice to kind of like figure out the main forms of your silhouette, but as you can see, I keep saying ZBrush. Blender does a pretty good job of keeping the brush on the outer parts of the mesh, the very silhouettic parts of the mesh. So you shouldn't have a problem with grabbing the outside parts of the silhouette and kind of fixing them to help you out. I don't remember if Blender actually had this as a feature to grab the outer part of the geometry based on the normals. I do remember that when I did try to sculpt, it was very, very annoying. It used to be very annoying to grab the mesh from certain angles, because it wasn't grabbing the outer part. It was actually just based off of your screen. And I think if you can change that by the settings right here. Yeah, the settings. Yeah, I think I don't really know. Like I said, I don't use a lot of this stuff, particularly inside of this. But as you can see, you could turn on grab silhouette, and that's going to help you to grab the silhouette of your model. But I honestly think it does a pretty good job vanilla. So don't really know. And then I think, yeah, I have no idea what's going on with this. I have no idea. There's so many options with this, but it doesn't feel like it's doing anything different. Would be my number one thing that I'd be, you know, saying. I don't feel like any of these are like literally changing anything. So yeah, this is where you would change like the main properties of the functionality of your brush. Textures is, I believe, where you would bring in the alphas to start working off of. Stroke, obviously, this is where you're going to get your stabilized stroke. So if we were working with a brush where you had to drag out, so let's say we wanted to get like some nice fine creases, but this is too wobbly because I am a mouse user, I would go in here and I would turn on stabilized stroke, and this would then stabilize my stroke to a more better feel for me to, fix. Okay. Now if we hit M, we'll bring up our masking brush. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to mask off any regions that we don't want to sculpt. I don't use this very often, but I do find myself using it more and more as I sculpt inside of Blender. And what this does is it essentially, what the name implies is that it masks off this area so that you don't affect it at all. So if we go back into our G and we start to move everything, you can see that it's only moving the unmasked areas. So if you want to quickly mess with the settings of your mouse, you can actually go in and hit A, and then this is going to bring up your mouse, or excuse me, your mask menu. So now we can clear the mask, and now we are affecting everything, all of the geometry again. Okay. We also have our fall off. We can actually determine the fall off of our grab brush, so we can go smooth, custom, smoother, sphere. And basically what this does is if we actually move this out, you can see how harsher it is on the edges of the brush versus the, the center where it's more smooth. And I believe if we actually go to view normal, it'll push away from the normal. Let me see if this will. Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I never actually got into sculpting inside of Blender, is because you want to push away from the normal or the face, and I don't really know how to do that. And I think they actually did fix that, but I don't remember how to do that. View normal. Okay, so I actually figured out how to move away from the normal. If you actually hold control, that'll actually move along the normals. Did not know that. I actually had to look that up. As well as I forgot to mention that there are some auto masking features up here that are very helpful. So if you're actually ever having a problem with your mesh and grabbing your mesh from one side, it usually has to do with some of these options. So make sure that some of these options are not enabled or enabled depending on what you want. So yeah, I did miss this part, and I also found out that holding control and dragging will actually move the mesh along the normals of the surface. So just a little quick hint or quick tip. Yeah. See, if you wanted to actually push it outwards like this from this viewpoint, I don't think you could do that, which is very, very weird to me. Yeah, you would have to really go in there and like really edit that, which kind of sucks. I really wish that they would have like maybe a method to do that. Maybe it is. Maybe there is an option for that, but I really don't know. In fact, only the vertices within a normal that faces the viewer. Stroke starts. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't know. It's dragging it up this way. It's weird. I don't know if they actually have a view, a way to do that. Anyways, so that's your fall off. So now if we actually bring it back to smooth, you can see how it's bringing up more of a point which is good for actually smoothing or with bringing out shapes. And if we go to smoother, you can see that this is essentially what the fall off is. It's just affecting how you're actually grabbing and moving the stuff and how it's going to be shaped while you're moving it or sculpting it, which again is very handy. Honestly, have no idea what I'm doing. Okay. So one thing that I would definitely say is bring up your muscle memory. Try to get that, worked out because it makes you less frustrated with sculpting. And muscle memory is a huge part of sculpting. You want to kind of do this fast without any interruptions. So you can kind of get something blocked in very quickly. Okay. Cursor is just basically how your cursor is displayed on the screen as you're sculpting. Nothing too amazing about that. And then we go over to these tools. Dynatopo is basically adding... it's kind of like if you've worked inside of ZBrush, it's kind of like... whatchamacallit? It's like adding geometry as you're sculpting. So if I were to actually use the snake hook, it's a very good example of that. As you can see, it's adding dynamic geometry as I'm sculpting. There's a few brushes that don't work with it, which I really wish they did, which is the smoothing brush. I really wish that the smoothing brush would actually work with Dynatopo, but unfortunately it does not. Then you also have remesh, which doesn't work if you have Dynatopo on, so you actually have to turn that off in order to remesh your mesh. So as you can see, this is with Dynatopo, and then if we actually remesh it, you can see that it's giving us a better resolution overall in general along the mesh. All right, so if we actually bring up our wireframe, you can see this is our wireframe, and then if we remesh it, you can see now it's distributing all of the geometry evenly across it. You can set this pretty low, just don't set it too low or else your computer will go haywire. I usually do a kind of 0.01 because it's nice when I'm getting in those finer details. I don't go lower than that because I usually end up just retopoing the model once I've gotten to this point, and then using modeling to refine the details of the model after that. So I don't really go any lower than this. There's really no point unless, I would need to get those really, really fine details in the eyes. Then I just use Dynatopo for that area only. That area, not the entire mesh. All right. All right. So again, we also have our symmetry up here. We can turn on X, Y, and Z symmetry. I usually work in the X plane, so that's obviously where both sides of the mesh are being worked on. But there's also a nice feature in here where it's symmetrized, which if you mess up one part of your mesh or you're working on one part of your mesh, let's bring up our snake hook again. Let's say I'm starting to work on this side, but I end up forgetting that I sculpted on the other side. So let's say I'm, making whatever this is. I don't know, maybe like an ear or whatever. And I'm like, oh crap, I forgot to do that same thing on the other side. Well, then if you go over here and you hit symmetrize from the negative X, which is over here, to the positive X, which is over here, then you will symmetrize your model. And you'll get your details back. I don't suggest this if you already cleaned up your mesh, although it does work when you've cleaned up your mesh. The unfortunate part about it is that it slices through the geometry and then it resims the model. So you might actually have to UV it again. But if you haven't UV'd it yet, then go ahead and use this. But if you have UV'd it, then you're going to have to re-UV everything. Okay? So, yeah. This is pretty much all of the sculpting. I'm trying to think of anything else that I might have missed. Shift F is where you can get, I believe, I think that's the fall off. Oh, look at that. See, I made changes over here and I forgot to turn on symmetry. So I'm going to say X plus to X negative. And now we have our symmetry. Turn that back on. And yeah. So Shift S brings up, I believe, our fall off. Okay. And I'm trying to think. Shift S brings up our smoothing. Let's turn off wireframe. Which I usually just use smoothing as it is with the brushes, so I don't usually switch over to smoothing. But yeah, and another brush that I usually use is the scrape brush, which is really good for building up planes of the face. And then you can kind of smoothen that down. Really good for making hard surface stuff as well in combination with your stabilize, so that you can actually get some really cool hard surfacey kind of looks in there. And yeah. All right. I'm trying to think of anything else that I might have missed. There's probably a couple of other things, but honestly, I can't think of them. I guess they might not be that important. You can also, again, like if you're doing hard surface, you can change it to a kind of more metallic-y look, but I like to stay in the realm of just being able to see my model. Yeah, I don't really know of anything else that there might need to be. So we went over W. Oh, yeah, you know what? E. E actually switches our drag dots, our functionality of our stroke from airbrushed, anchored, line, curve, dots. So line, I believe, will actually just give us a line, which is very nice for, again, sculpting that really, really harsh details. So if I actually go into line and start to sculpt that, you can see that this is going to give us some really good, quick lines for our sculpt. And again, curve. So we can actually, I don't know if we can actually drag out with our curve. I think that's based on a curve, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. I don't really use that very often. And then we also have airbrush, which just makes it more intense as it's being drug over. So if we turn off stabilize, it's just yeah, it's supposed to be making it more intense as we drag over, but it's kind of working as like a dots functionality where, wow, I think those are mixed up. But yeah, this is a good way to kind of like accentuate your features, smoothen that down and such. So, you know, mess around with these options and see what you like. Because you never know what you're actually going to, you know, stumble across, like with combination of a texture and maybe drag dot, you know, where if I had like a more kind of hard surfacey type texture inside of my menu, probably be something that's good for creating some bolts and stuff like that. It would be pretty decent. All right. Okay, so this is pretty much the sculpting aspect of this. I don't really know what else to state. I don't really use face sets and such. Don't really use any of this stuff in this. It's not really something that, it's more advanced, I guess, than what I'm doing in this tutorial series. But yeah, you might want to look up like face sets inside of sculpting if you want to use this, because I don't really use any of this. It's, I guess, like polygroups inside of ZBrush would be the thing what that is, but I don't really use it, so I should probably start using it more. But yeah, this has been the sculpting aspect of the series, and hope you guys learned a lot about this. Oh yes, one other thing, if you go over to here and you go to your tool menu, you can actually also change a lot of the tools properties over here as well. So there's a lot of advanced stuff over here that we did cover mostly in this area, up here. But you can have that all inside of this viewport right here, and then you can, if you actually hit Control Space, you can actually increase the size of your window and be able to change a lot of stuff over here that would help you out. All right. So this has been part 1 of the series of learning modeling and sculpting, and then in the next part we will start on the character. All right. So thank you guys so much for watching, and see you guys in the next part. Bye.